I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Pat Jones, whom I first met in 1970 when we were active members of the Young Christian Students. I have watched Pat's ministry, career, from a distance as she's devoted herself to be at the service of the Catholic Church in England and Wales. Dr. Pat Jones was also a close friend and colleague of Archbishop Warlock, whose 20-year ecumenical partnership with Bishop David Shepherd was the original inspiration that led to Together to the Common Good. Involved in ecumenical work in Liverpool throughout the 1980s, Pat was also advisor and director of adult Christian education for Liverpool's Catholic Archdiocese, and she was appointed as the first female Assistant General Secretary of the Bishops' Conference of England and Wales. She was also Deputy Director of CAFOD and Director of the Prisons Education Trust. She holds several degrees in Theology and Religious Studies and was awarded a CBE in 2012 for services to prisoners learning. In 2019, Dr. Pat Jones, CBE, completed research with the Centre for Catholic Studies at the University of Durham in collaboration with Caritas Social Action Network. Pat's work explored Catholic identity and faith-based provision among diverse charities in the Caritas network in England and Wales that seek to end homelessness in personal, regional and national contexts. In April 2020, the National Pastoral Congress had its 40th anniversary. Dr. Pat wrote an article for The Tablet as she planned, facilitated and wrote up the findings of that Congress. In that article, she writes, "Although in Liverpool in 1980 few of us had heard the word synodality, it's clear looking back that the Congress could best be described as a synodal process." We're delighted to have Pat with us today and for her to share her expertise and experience in guiding the Church to once again being an Easter people. Thank you very much, Pat.
Okay, well, first of all, thanks very much for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be with ACTA today, and I've particularly valued being in the small groups, which is always such a valuable part of anything like this. My perspective is quite particular. I had 20 years, if you like, in the thick of it, working on the National Pastoral Congress, the Archdiocese of Liverpool, the Bishops' Conference, the Laity Synod, as Peter Coughlin mentioned. And then I kind of took a different direction and had 20 years observing from the ground level, just from ordinary parish belonging, first in Guildford and now just latterly in Nottingham. And both perspectives are really helpful and really important. For what I'm talking about, Zoom's a bit frustrating because I'd really like to start by asking how many of you remember the Congress. I suspect quite a lot of people, the Pastoral Congress in Liverpool. But time and technology don't make that possible. So I'm going to reflect alone. Frank asked me if I'd talk about the National Pastoral Congress, and I said to him, surely that's not relevant now, it's ancient history. And he insisted, and I have come to accept that I think he was right. I think it's important to look back and see the journey that we've made locally as another part of the picture that we're building up from this morning. So there's two things I want to talk about. First is just to recall the Pastoral Congress in 1980, what it was about, and then a sort of unfinished and rather partial overview of some of the journey that we've taken since in this whole area of synodality. And in the International Theological Commission document on synodality, it talks about it as both a way of being the Church, a very broad concept, as well as an event and a process. And I'm a bit more concerned here with synodality as an event and a process, which then leads to a way of being church. I'm going to share screen and hope that that works. Can you see, Frank?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, good. So just a reminder for anyone who wasn't around in 1980, though I suspect a lot of us were. This process started in the early 1970s when the National Conference of Priests and the bishops together set up a working party on pastoral strategy, and their work led to a consultation document called A Time for Building. And That was widely discussed and consulted on and led to this idea of a National Pastoral Congress, and Derek Warlock was tasked to organise it, and indeed no one else could have. And I joined the organising committee in September 1978. There was 18 months preparation. There was a consultation on themes which led to 45,000 responses. And then there were discussion papers, 8 of them, for local discussion and diocesan discussion. There were diocesan reports, every organisation could join in. And then 2,100 people gathered for 5 days in Liverpool and worked in small groups, medium-sized groups, and then sector groups. And each of those 32 medium-sized groups produced around 25 to 50 proposals, and then they were gathered into sector reports and a single report. There was voting on all the proposals, and all the proposals were published. And those 2 factors are hugely significant. Doctrine was not off the agenda. All the difficult issues could be discussed. And the key to the experience was the fundamental equality we had. Most of the people who led all of it were lay people. All the bishops and priests were there. A few were leaders, but most of them were ordinary members who took part in the queues and the groups just like anyone else. And then afterwards, the bishops, some months later, published a response which echoed and affirmed a great deal of what the Congress had said, but which some people took as an unhelpful separation of their voice. I was part of the group that wrote the Easter People above the garage in Archbishop's House in Liverpool for a couple of months that summer. And then afterwards, there was the 80s and 90s, when all sorts of other assemblies and congresses happened around the country, which I'll come to later on. But I first of all want to just pick out a few lessons, a few reflections on the Pastoral Congress that happened in Liverpool in 1980. It wasn't formally a national synod. It wasn't constituted according to canon law. Indeed, the 1983 Code of Canon Law, which talked about things like pastoral councils, was still to emerge. But it was as near to a national synod as it could be. The elements of synodality were all there, although we didn't then have access to some of the rich concepts which Francis has now laid before us. And indeed, we were feeling our way. But it was steeped in prayer and sacraments. It was listening, it was inclusive, it was whole church, and it had an orientation outwards and inwards. In May last year, it was 40 years since the Congress, a fact I don't like to recall too often because it points to my age and probably that of many others. But for me, it was deeply formative, and I've reflected a lot on what it meant. And there's 4 brief points that I'd like to make from what I see from this distance as the lessons to learn, which may be valuable as we embark on this new synodal journey. The first is that from the beginning, we have to think about our expectations and hopes. One of the things I found as in the years after the Congress is that people didn't really have a sense of how change happens in the church, of how slow, complex, messy, and cultural it is. It doesn't happen by edict. It happens through nudges, crises, inspirations, viral contagion, when your parish looks at what's happening in the next door parish and says, we want to do that, and many other factors. It's as much a matter of Catholic culture as about policies or strategies. And it's as much a responsibility as a responsibility of the few. After the Congress, it felt rather as if everyone went home and waited for somebody else to implement it. Despite the fizzing euphoria of the experience itself, when it came to brass tacks in my local parish or your local parish, the process stumbled. But perhaps it was also the expectations. Maybe we were a little naive. Maybe we didn't yet understand what we'd done. I used to see regularly in 1985, for example, the Tablet published an article titled The Forgotten Congress. But now I'd argue very strongly that in the following 20 years, perhaps the majority of the things that the Congress asked for happened to some degree, perhaps not everywhere, and not always in the form expected, but somehow. But I can't prove any of this was the fruit of the Congress itself, and neither really do I need to. Rather, what I want to suggest is that the Congress kind of turbocharged our awareness and changed our horizons, and most importantly, our relationships with each other. In a way, it moved the bottom line of the pre-conciliar church and it was a staging post in the complex process of becoming the post-conciliar church. Realising its vision, which itself was a bringing home to England and Wales of Vatican II, has taken decades and has merged and blended with other keynote events such as the papal visit. And it's also necessarily been influenced by our wider social culture, our crises and our failures as well. It's very interesting to me that the ambitious synodal processes in Germany and Australia are prompted in very significant part by their response to the impact of the clerical child abuse crisis. The same could be true here if we listen to it seriously. And their aim of those two processes, a very strong agenda within their processes, is simply to dismantle clericalism. And I think that's very instructive of the complexity of how things are presented, what they're really about, and how they relate to all the multiple strands that are part of our ecclesial and our wider social reality. And all of this is what we have to reflect on and discern about in synodal processes, how we get a kind of balance in our expectations between being daring and being realistic, and having a framework in which we understand the ways and systems and channels and slowness of how change happens. The second is that we have to think about what outcomes there might be. What are the tactics and strategies and risks involved? The Synod preparatory document asks us, what steps does the Spirit invite us to take in order to grow in our journeying together? There is an orientation towards practical outcomes in a synodal process. And as the diocesan phase of this synodal process gets underway, practical ideas must surely be looked for and emerge. But often these are framed as propositions, certainly at the Pastoral Congress in Liverpool they were. And propositions don't turn into strategy or activity overnight. In all my experience of both the Pastoral Congress and of later diocesan congresses and assemblies, this is one of the most difficult skills, how to shape a process at any level so that there are among the desiderata, the statements of desires and the statements of vision, some proposals that are somehow actionable. Too often we end with these lists of all the things we'd like to see, usually framed as more of this and more of that. And somehow these have to be fashioned into actual things that people can take on and do. The people responsible need to be identified, and those basic principles of planning need to be considered: resources, capacity, timing, and so on. And this will get more difficult in the post-pandemic church, where income has diminished and the amount of staff that dioceses have and the church has at national level is severely under threat, reducing our capacity to be able to act on new things that we want to do. I also have learned that quite often what we need to do in advance is identify some of the areas where we might have quick wins, where we might build confidence, as well as some longer term goals to which a first step can be taken. And we need some actions that signify or symbolize change. We can make synodal processes better if we think about these kind of things as we're starting and get clear some of what we hope might emerge, in order that people can see that we can answer the thing that's most commonly heard, and certainly came up in my group this morning, of people saying, it's only a talking shop. What difference will it make? We need to change that and build new confidence, and believe that the Holy Spirit can work through good planning as well as prayerful listening and discernment. And I think this is important in relation to a worry I have reading the preparatory text for the 2023 Synod. The theology it sets out and the practice it describes of journeying together is very beautiful. But there's a risk, however, that we will linger in the spiritual and relational space, which is so nourishing. And I want to suggest we need also the urgency of arriving somewhere. We need to understand that getting somewhere is actually also what the Spirit asks of us.
Thank you. Thank you.
And the other risk too that I see in the documents that we now have is that the nourishing experience of synodality itself, and I believe it is, I think it's tremendously enriching, might distract us from the wider outward-looking social mission, and that we need to make sure that we're not simply attending to the internal life of the church, much as we would like that to be different and to grow and become more faithful and inclusive and so on, but that we keep a very clear eye on what Francis calls the peripheries, or what is for most of us the reality where we actually live our daily mission. I'm also doing some research at the moment about YCW in the 1950s and 60s. I'm looking at the impact of young Christian workers on the lives of young working class Catholic women who had no voice and no power. And one of the striking things about what happened to them through involvement in YCW is that they came to see that their workplaces, their factories, their offices and their shops were the place of their mission. And that focus on the world of work was what distinguished them. And I worry that in some of our agenda today, we tend to lose that fundamental reality, which is true, particularly true of us as the baptized. And my third point is just to recall one significant thing that I learned a great deal from the Pastoral Congress about voting. It's intricate but important because often it's how decisions get made. The Synod Vademecum says that synodal processes are not a kind of parliament, not, quote, a political battle in which, in order to govern, one side must defeat the other. And Francis repeatedly stresses that synodal walking is a spiritual process concerned with, as Gemma talked about this morning, interpreting our prayerful desires to see where the Spirit is leading us. Happily, he also notes that decisions are an important element. And if you're going to make decisions together at a level beyond a small group, then you need some kind of voting. But we need to think about voting in a different way from how it works in electoral politics or committee meetings. In Sector C of the National Pastoral Congress, they covered marriage and family life, which meant they had all the contentious issues, divorce, contraception, intercommunion. They talked about all these heavy doctrine things. The voting was arranged with great care. It was used not to divide people, but to identify degrees of consensus. The proposals advanced in steps towards more radical change, asking each time how many could support this further step, and minority voices were allowed their space and their vote. It was a model of inclusion and care and truthful searching for what the faith of the Church gathered there was saying. We need mutually respectful ways to identify consensus without excluding or defeating people, but trying to pursue the fullness of where the Spirit is leading us and the pace at which it is moving us, and to allow space for people to be at different stages in their own discernment. And the right kind of voting can help that to happen. And that brings me to my fourth reflection, which is about the sensus fidelium. The two great gifts of this new concept of synodality, which we're learning, one is discernment, which has been well explored already, and the other is the concept of the sensus fidelium, which has been around since Vatican II, but I don't think we've been taught about it very much. And I don't remember it ever being invoked when we were planning the Pastoral Congress. So perhaps this is the age of coming to terms with or coming to explore what sensus fidelium means. I really like something that Francis says about it. If I can move my slide on. He says, the flock have an instinctive ability to discern the new ways that the Lord is revealing to the Church. He doesn't say just about doctrine, or he doesn't say leave doctrine out. New ways the Lord is revealing could be strategies, could be policies, could be relationships, it can be all sorts of things. And if we have that instinctive ability, the question is, how do we operationalize it? How do we bring that to bear on reality? One of my strongest memories of the Congress is on the last day of the heartfelt, blazing strength with which the sectors, the full Congress, all 2,000 people, affirmed in applause what they heard when the final 7 reports were read out. It was like a great yes to what was laid before them, a response from the heart as well as the head. And I interpret that as an expression of the sensus fidelium, not just because of that moment and the real, the depth of euphoria we felt, but because of the process and preparation which had led there. The 45,000 responses, the 8 discussion papers, the diocesan reports, all the publishing of every word that had been said at every level. All of that meant that when we gave that final great amen to the Congress vision, we could really trust, as Cardinal Hume said in his homily shortly afterwards, that the Holy Spirit had been there and was fully present. But we should still be cautious. It doesn't help to claim the sensus fidelium for every change a particular group espouses. And we still somehow have to reckon with the voices who find themselves outside whatever consensus emerges, because for better or worse, we all belong together. And it seems likely that the sensus fidelium, like the church, will have inherent contradictions, tensions, and wrong turning. And there's probably a vulnerability built into it that I find that I struggle with quite a bit in how central the role of the bishop is in this process, in listening to the people of God, listening to all that we say and interpreting it. Peter mentioned often the need for the apostolic role of bishops, and in theory, I'm completely supportive of that. But I also struggle with what happens when, at times, we also have to recognise that our bishops have their own bias, have their own weaknesses and their own failures. If the child abuse crisis has taught us anything, it's also taught us that sometimes our leaders also get it badly wrong, and somehow we have to protest until it's put right. And I think that the risk is that in this process too, the utter dependence at that point on the interpretative role of the bishops is a vulnerable point, which is helped by the collegiality of which Peter spoke, but it also points to, again, crucially, the role we have to play. The tension here between that conciliar principle of the sensus fidelium and the equally important principle of the prophetic mandate of the baptized tells us that we have to risk saying difficult things, not because we can claim that they alone represent the sensus fidelium, but because they come from our faith and demand to be voiced. We have to affirm the prophetic voices, which are the voices of protest, the voices that disturb us, the voices that make us uncomfortable. Even for us, there will be voices of that kind. And secondly, we have to ensure that we tell the bishops as much as we can. We have to not hold back. We talked about this in my group. We have to ask for meetings. We have to put up with the fact that they don't have time to answer their emails. We have to take a big share of the responsibility of ensuring that they are pushed to carry out their task. The final part of what I want to say just is to recall more of the journey that we've travelled. It starts with a memory. I was just 23 when the Congress happened, 21 when I joined the planning committee. I was studying theology at Heathrow. And one of my memories is that I was surrounded by all these people who were 20 or 30 years older than me. I'm thinking of one in particular. She was called Ruby, and she was the dowager of the Liturgy Commission and the Catholic Women's League in Liverpool. And she was probably in her 70s, and she was a very large lady with a fur stole and one of those little hats that women in the 50s wore. She kind of looked a bit like Bessie Braddock, who was a famous Liverpool MP. And Ruby, she was a tremendous woman who had served a lifetime of faithfulness to the church, but she had grown up completely in a church that was nothing of my experience. What I realized looking back is that those 2,000 people who gathered had grown up in a church shaped in the pre-conciliar ways of thinking, acting, practicing, and living. And the church we were trying to shape was so different. It's no wonder that it's taken time. At that time, lay involvement was pay, pray, and obey, or associational life, all the organizations. Lay ministry was unknown. Priests were plentiful and obviously in charge of everything. And yet the Congress asked them to fashion a new kind of church, inclusive, radically inspired by the gospel, turning outward to our society and its needs, when they barely emerged from being an embattled and mostly poor minority. So it's not surprising that change takes time. But look at where we've come from. Perhaps, I mean, this is a real sketch, but the 1970s, co-responsibility, the Pastoral Council, there was quite a stress at that time on structures. And we were all trying to have pastoral councils, though not many of us did. There were some diocesan pastoral councils. And then that process that led to the Congress itself, A Time for Building discussion and the Church 2000, which followed it. Then in the 1980s, perhaps one of the great decades where consultation was the big thing, the Congress itself and the Easter people that followed it. And then Peter mentioned the 1987 Synod on the Laity, for which there was widespread local consultation. I found on my shelf earlier the booklet of discussion leaflets that were issued across England and Wales. And then we began to see diocesan assemblies too. Diocesan synods, diocesan congresses and assemblies, usually preceded by parish and local consultation. And at this point, we started to move into the kind of retrieval of Vatican II that started after the 1985 synod, where communion ecclesiology, the idea of the church as a communion, started to come to the forefront. But unfortunately, around that time too, perhaps the Catholic culture wars were starting to be at their height. All the debates about whether Vatican II needed to be interpreted as a continuity with the past or a rupture, a new thing. And the beautiful communion ecclesiology got rather pulled back into hierarchical communion. It was a bit like those two chapters in Lumen Gentium that Peter talked about, the chapter about the people of God and the chapter about the hierarchy, kept changing places. And there was a bit of a tug of war between them. But there was also quite a lot of emphasis there on collaborative ministry, and I was involved in the document, The Sign We Give, and a real sense of growth in how many of us were involved in lay ministry at all sorts of levels in the church. And that was a step forward. And then as we moved towards the 2000s, perhaps the mark of what happened in these decades was about diocesan processes of consultation for parish reorganization, usually framed in terms of missionary outlook, but often needing to concentrate on what we were to do with fewer priests. So leaving Safe Harbours in Liverpool, Forward Together in Hope in Hexham, At Your Word, Lord in Arundel and Brighton. And they too were deeply consultative. These aren't stages that leave each other behind, they're stages that grow into each other. And often led more clearly to decisions and outcomes because they had to, because of the number of priests and the need to reorganise parishes. And then from 2013 onwards, we have been graced and gifted with this concept of synodality and this retrieval of the sensus fidelium and the concept of discernment, and also on the focus on the peripheries. So the question might be, where do we go next? And this process that we're involved in now shows us that in a way, it's all to play for. If we can encourage people to set aside the cynicism or the apathy that's come from their very real experience that too often these processes haven't led anywhere, if we can believe that, as Chris Knowles wrote in this week's tablet, that when people actually do sit down and do what the synod documents suggest, then we will be changed, then somehow that will bear fruit. And if we can hold into that some of our determination to make sure that some of the hard edges are also kept strongly involved, that outward-looking focus, the peripheries, the need for decisions, and recognise that we have been, as the International Theological Commission document said, we have been maturing in this, and we should take both comfort and inspiration from the fact that we know a great deal about synodality already, and we are well equipped to organise it and make it fruitful for us in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pat. That was very, very good. When we discussed Pat's contribution to this session, there was a condition. And the condition was that she wanted to hear what was actually happening in dioceses up and down England and Wales. So rather than have a question and answer session, and rather than have a workshop session at the end of this one, we've invited 4 people to speak to us relatively briefly about how the synodal process is starting to take place in their particular part of the world, in their particular diocese. We have 4 people to speak, and I would rather introduce all 4, ask them to unmute, and then they can follow one after the other. From the Archdiocese of Westminster, we have Laurie Clark. From the Diocese of East Anglia, we have Martin Pakes. From the Diocese of Leeds, we have Vince Borg. And from the Diocese of Salford, we have Father Paul Daly, who's the Episcopal Vicar in the diocese. And that will be the order in which we hear from them. So I will stop talking. I'll ask those 4 to unmute, and I'll invite Laurie Clark from the Archdiocese of Westminster to speak first.
Hello. This is my own personal knowledge of the Westminster Diocese synodality pathway. Westminster's journey started on the weekend of the 2nd to 3rd of October with a letter either read out at masses or as a leaflet to be picked up. At our church, we listen to a recording of the Cardinal's message. A parish synodal representative should have been appointed by the 3rd of October, but nothing has been announced in our parish yet. Although, to be fair, we are in the process of having a new parish priest. At a very recent West London Justice and Peace Network meeting, some people had heard the letter from Cardinal Nichols read out in their churches, though not all. Some, but not all, had known that parishes were being asked to appoint a synodal pathway parish representative, either because they had been asked by their parish priest to serve, or it had been announced from the pulpit. The process does extend beyond parishes, hence the reference to other communities. There is a diocesan information document with dates about when things will happen, with a liturgical opening in Westminster Cathedral today, local launch in parishes tomorrow, training sessions later this month, and events and activities in parishes and other communities from the end of October to the beginning of December, with online listening events. Then in late November to early December, there will be area listening events with one of our 3 auxiliary bishops. Submissions are due by the 17th of December. The pathway ends on the 15th of January with a diocesan gathering in our cathedral. The other communities referred to earlier will include an online listening event in early November for people involved in Caritas and Justice and Peace. Also under this heading of other communities, the Cardinal himself is meeting with young adults in early November. That's it, thank you.
Do you want me to carry straight on, Frank?
Thank you. Yes, please, Martin.
Right, from East Anglia, we had a slightly different process. We had our own bishop, Alan Hopes, put out a pastoral letter. I've links in the chat if anyone wants to have a read. Essentially, this is asking for a structure to be set up. There's a diocesan central team. They're asking for reps in each parish to help out with this synodal process. Last Sunday, I asked our parish priest, have we got a rep yet? Because I hadn't heard anything. And he said, oh, would you consider doing it, Martin? Which was not quite the answer I was expecting. So I said, look, I'm not going to stand in anyone's way, but, you know, if you haven't got anybody else, I will. He seemed exceptionally grateful for that because it seemed the diocese was busy pressurizing him to come up with a name. So we haven't got anything as detailed as Westminster. There will be events. There is a special mass at the cathedral in Norwich tomorrow to commission the representatives. I'm not sure if I am the representative yet, and therefore whether I'm going. So the aspect, if you have a look at that letter I sent the link to, it is very clear from Alan Hopes that doctrine is not up for discussion in any form at all. And he's not asking for input on that at all, which I think is rather at variance with the tweets that the Pope himself put out about an hour ago, which I'll quote and finish on, which is, the Spirit asks us to listen to the questions, concerns, and hopes of every church, people, and nation, and to listen to the world, to the challenges and changes that it sets before us. Let us not soundproof our hearts. Let us listen to one another. Couldn't have put it better myself. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Vince Ball, Leeds.
Okay, this is from Leeds, the Leeds Diocese. Now, Bishop Marcus was appointed in September 2014. The diocese has 83 parishes 115 churches served by 71 parish priests and 9 assistant priests. 48 priests are retired. ACTA Leeds has over 150 supporters who receive a quarterly e-newsletter which reports on our open Zoom meetings and which share good practice. Recently, we've been focusing on the synodal processes, looking at Liverpool, for example. We know that there is a real contribution that we can and must make at this critical time. In September 2019, Bishop Marcus proposed a listening exercise following his establishment of a Diocesan Pastoral Council. At that time, Pope Francis had intended to hold a Synod of Bishops in 2022. Bishop Marcus commissioned a member of the diocesan clergy and a deacon to coordinate a listening project involving all clergy, laity and schools across the many parishes which together comprise our one diocese. Provisionally entitled From Parish to Mission, all constructive views would be actively sought. A document entitled The Discernment of a Pastoral Plan for the Diocese of Leeds was sent by Bishop Marcus to clergy. It was accompanied by a discussion paper which was entitled From Parish to Mission, prepared by a Pastoral Council working party. This detailed the purposes and practical approaches being proposed for the listening exercise. So, for example, there would be trained facilitators from across the parishes. And this paper was discussed by the deaneries, but did not include laity. Crucially, the Leeds listening exercise was planned to start in Lent 2022 because of the pandemic. Now, in May, Pope Francis presented his revised format and timescale for a synod. So in September, Bishop Marcus issued a pastoral letter setting out a single approach to a synodal process in Leeds. He outlined the World Synodal Agenda, starting with parishes and local communities in October, culminating with the Synod of Bishops in 2023. The deanery discussion papers would now be available for everyone through the diocesan website. In reality, that pastoral letter was probably the first time that most parishioners had heard of the diocesan listening exercise. Now, David Jackson from ACTA Leeds is now a member of the diocesan steering group. He writes that the deans and parish priests have already identified about 80 lay facilitators. They will attend 2 training days conducted by the Jesuits at Hinsley Hall on today. Ironically, that's why he's not reporting to you today, and also next Saturday, the 23rd of October. And the Liturgy of Commissioning will be held at the Cathedral tomorrow. The facilitators will be organised in teams of 3 to hold meetings in all parishes in November and the first 2 weeks of December. They'll be allocated to 2 or 3 parishes, but not their own. A questionnaire is being prepared, a diocesan adaptation of the Vatican's. Secondary school pupils will be led through this by teachers in their year groups. It will be made available to focus groups and online. Individuals can send their responses into the diocese or even direct to the Synod office in Rome. The questionnaire ought to be made available to all Catholics, no matter whether they go to church or not, have real issues or not, feel excluded, are indifferent or engaged in whatever way with the parish or school. Also, non-Catholic members of other denominations of faith, anyone who has an interest or involvement, connection with the church, is invited to complete the questionnaire. Now, we send updated information to ACTA Leeds supporters in our e-newsletter. We'll be happy to share that with you, by the way, if anyone's interested. ACTA Leeds is giving its fullest encouragement for people to engage with the synodal processes being planned. We also believe that when we meet or take action as ACTA Leeds or as individuals in dialogue, we are part of that synodal process. Synodality needs to be embedded as part of our faith practice in the years ahead.
Thank you, Vince.
Okay. And my turn now, Paul Daly from Salford Diocese. On behalf of Bishop John, really, because I know when you invited him, he said he would have been here, but there was already something in his diary. just two personal links with what we're talking about. First of all, it's been a pleasure to be part of this and to hear the contributions of all of you and the speakers, but particularly on a personal note, to hear Peter Coghlan for the first time in 32 years. And Peter, if you remember what David Blower will also remember as cuckoo contracts, you kindly took me and 3 other students to a Japanese tea ceremony and my first ever Japanese restaurant. So that's one personal link. The other, which is more relevant to the theme, is that the bishop who accepted me for the Diocese of Salford, Thomas Holland, was one of those, on the Wikipedia doesn't mention it, who on the floor of the council in 1965 or 1964 suggested what became the Synod of Bishops. But in a sense, in these few moments, I don't want to focus on our participation in the Universal Synod. I want to focus on our thoughts as to what we might do following it as we prepare for a very different reality, not just in terms of the number of clergy and the number of parishes, but more in terms of what is the Holy Spirit asking the Church of Salford to be in the future, and how can we listen to as many voices so that we can discern what the Spirit is saying. And I'm going to talk in general brushstrokes. We've done a lot of work on a possible roadmap. Some of you may have seen it because it was very briefly displayed with lots of kind words on the Vatican Synod Office's social media presence, until I pointed out we'd not shared it in the diocese yet. So it's still a work in progress. But the inspiration really came from our Lenten diocesan course on Zoom on Pope Francis Let Us Dream, which was blessed to have the participation of Austin Ivory. So he led us on that journey. And some people began to say, well, okay, is this a way of planning and listening and discerning for the future? So in a sense, we're approaching the Rome Synod element as, if you like, the antipasti, the hors d'oeuvres, the appetizer for our own diocesan journey. The bishop is launching that, the Rome element, tomorrow. But after that element is complete, we need some time. Our friends in Liverpool have said, don't rush the prayer and the formation. So we need some time on that. It seems strange, the formation coming after the first stage of it, but there you go. We do what the timetable allows. So it'll be a time of formation. And then this is the key thing, I think. We want to make the listening as broad as possible. So not just in parishes, but to particular groups on the margins. For example, Catholics who are alienated from the church, we need to hear their stories. Those on the peripheries, we don't just want to talk to our diocesan Caritas workers, we want them to talk to the people that they minister to and bring back their perspectives. Bishop John on Thursday has got an evening with members of the LGBTQ plus community in response to the recent letter that came out from the Holy Office on blessings for gay and lesbian people. And also, the survivors of abuse is a particular group that we wish to create a safe space for them to share their stories. One other group I'm going to mention is priests as well, to find a safe space in which priests can actually share with us what their fears are, what are their anxieties, what may be holding some of them back from embracing this vision. And that whole first stage is key because, if the church is good at anything, it's providing the answers to the questions that people are not asking. So we want to ask, we want to ask people what they are asking. I think just a couple of final thoughts. First of all, that we need to model in the way we go about this a genuine synodal way. So we're hoping that those who are asked to moderate the synod, that it will be, a male and female balance, a lay and ordained balance, if anything, with lay people, including those in consecrated life in the majority. So to kind of embed that structure from the beginning. And finally, I was delighted to hear that the Liverpool Synod got 27,000 responses. And so if you ask me what will be the success of a Salford synodal process, I would say it's very simply, if we can get at least 27,001 responses. Not that there's such a thing as Manchester Liverpool rivalry. So that's where we are.
Thank you very much, Father Paul. Thank you very much to all our contributors. I think that's been enormously helpful, and I'm grateful to Pat Jones for suggesting that that was the kind of way to finish a look at how we have consulted in the past. I've had one eye on the video and one eye on the clock, because part of my job is to make sure that we stay on target, and it's exactly 2:20, and my timetable says 2:20 we go to a workshop. Again, questions that we have discussed with our speakers. You have two of them, and I'll bring them up in case you don't have your document to hand. The first one is, what